Anarcho-capitalist YouTuber, That Guy T, released a video titled Libertarian Fascism, where he essentially said that it was important for libertarians to merge with the right in order to win and defeat the left, given that this is the most important priority right now, and one cannot start at the end game, but rather progress towards a libertarian society. But it brought up an interesting question, which was partly addressed in the video, which is, why do libertarians always lose? I mean, they always do. Even in this past election season, the libertarian candidate Gary Johnson garnered around 3% of the vote, even in a year in which both of the mainstream candidates were relatively unpopular. Now, I think there are two sides to this question, and one of them is practical and one of them is cultural. From a practical standpoint, I think the reason why libertarians have always failed on the political front, at least on influencing US policy, is that democracy allows for a sort of legal theft or reallocation of property from more successful people to less successful people through the polls. In other words, there's always going to be a minority of people who are more successful, and democracy inherently allows for people to vote to take money away from the more successful people. But the second reason is from a pragmatist standpoint. In other words, if you are a politician, it is in your interest to expand the government. And the reason for this is very clear. If you expand the government, you will not only be increasing your power, as you only care about your power and not necessarily the country, since you don't own the country, but rather are acting as a temporary representative of a certain group which has the ability to allocate resources. But it also is to your advantage to grow the government, because in a democratic system, the lobbyists are going to be supporting you. The people who are taxed are a diffuse group which do not necessarily feel the impact all that hard, since it's usually spread out. But the beneficiaries of government intervention benefit tremendously. For example, if you tax everyone in the United States a small amount to give money to a farmer, the people who are taxed are not going to feel that much of an impact, at least in the immediate sense. But the farmer will feel a tremendous impact, and thus these types of programs will be tremendously beneficial for him. What this means is that for any sort of interest group, in order to please them, it's quite easy politically, if you want to get the support of these dedicated interest groups, to offer them money or benefits in the form of government programs or regulations. Whereas the people who would normally be opposed to these regulations or the subsidizing of different groups aren't really present in the same sense, since the effects of taxation and regulation are much more diffuse on the general public as a whole, which means that it's almost always in your incentive as a representative to increase the size of the government in order to favor these interest groups, which will then back you and give you more chance of being elected. But the second reason why libertarians always seem to lose is a cultural one. In other words, if you look to the status quo, the majority of people don't really seem to care about libertarianism. I mean, it's simply a fact. The majority of people, if you ask them what they identify as, they'll say maybe liberal, conservative, some maybe traditionalist or even communist, but libertarian really isn't that common. Now, if you ask a lot of people about their personal governing philosophy, you actually might come out with a more clear example of people who believe in libertarian economics governing the government, but they still don't necessarily principally identify as libertarian. An example of this is a lot of conservatives. A lot of people who identify as conservative don't necessarily disagree with a lot of libertarian policies. However, that's not what animates them, and that's not what they necessarily choose to identify as. And the reason for this is because libertarians tend to simply be an economic philosophy. And the fact of the matter is that from a political standpoint, even if economics is incredibly important, it's not what excites people. It's not what animates people. If you ask why people think it's super important to vote for someone like Donald Trump, what they'll generally give you is something like he's going to stop illegal immigration, he's going to deport the illegal immigrants, or perhaps that he's going to not be in favor of Planned Parenthood. If you're voting for Hillary, it's pretty much the opposite. Hillary's a feminist, and she's going to support women's equal rights, and she is going to allow for amnesty for illegal immigrants. But if you notice, these are not necessarily the type of economic issues that are generally pushed by libertarians. And this follows a general principle that what excites people is more of a cultural dynamic. People get excited over politics not generally because they care about auditing the Fed, as many libertarians have put it, but because they care about maintaining either the America that they grew up in, or returning to a point in American history that they view as better, or in the case of the left, to abolishing that period of American history. And this is one of the problems with libertarians, is that from a cultural standpoint, they really haven't put forth anything to go along with the economic philosophy. And thus, if you're someone that cares about something, you are generally not necessarily going to identify primarily as a libertarian, because what's more important to a lot of people is not so much whether the Fed is audited or whether income tax is abolished, so much as what is happening with regards to demographics or immigration or abortion or even gay marriage to some extent, or being opposed to gay marriage. But the second problem when it comes to the cultural side is that when libertarians do have a cultural element, it seems to be more about just doing whatever you please, and that's their cultural take on things. Libertarians, for example, run on a policy of, oh, we are going to allow polyamorous relationships, or we are going to allow people to smoke weed. But then they're also going to say, well, we allow for this, and we believe that this is okay. Now, from a governmental standpoint, that might necessarily be true. I'm not saying necessarily that whether or not the government should necessarily regulate those things. But even if you do not believe that the government should be involved in dictating culture, culture is still something that is a battle to be won. When a culture is dominant, there's always going to be losers. Cultures cannot necessarily coexist together, which is why the concept of multiculturalism is such a disaster, and that it inevitably produces conflict. And thus, live and let live, even if it's a correct governing philosophy, does not animate people. It does not encourage people necessarily to be part of a movement, and it's not what people care about. And the third and final thing with regards to losing on the cultural front is that libertarians seem to awkwardly ally with the left. And this is always going to be a flawed solution to the libertarian problem, because at the end of the day, leftism is relatively incompatible with libertarianism. Hans Hermann Hoppe, a libertarian philosopher and anarcho-capitalist, has made this case time and time again that leftism is not compatible with libertarianism. An example of this is the leftist idea of radical egalitarianism, in that leftists believe that all men are exactly the same, and all genders are the same, and all groups and cultures are exactly the same. Now, this is obviously not backed up by any sort of evidence or studies, but the reason why it makes leftism so incompatible with libertarianism is that an essential part of libertarianism, which is essentially the belief in the importance of property and the respect for property rights. An essential part of property rights, if not the most essential part of property rights, is the ability to discriminate, something which leftists and left libertarians argue against, when really this is one of the most important parts of libertarianism. You cannot say that you have respect for property rights and then not allow discrimination. It's simply a contradiction, which is why Gary Johnson, I would argue, was never a libertarian, as he was against laws allowing for discrimination. In other words, if libertarians were ideologically consistent, they would lobby against the Civil Rights Act and lobby for its removal, because that's a direct contradiction of the libertarian value of respect for property rights. Another area in which libertarians are relatively contradictory is with regards to border control. A lot of left libertarians argue, oh, we should have open borders and we should just allow everyone in, which first of all ignores the practical reality that we have a welfare state in the US and a government which exists. And as the libertarian Milton Friedman once said, you cannot have open borders and a welfare state. You must choose one or the other. As well as the fact that border control is an essential part of property rights. And finally, statistically and practically, the type of people who do not want state involvement tend to be more right-wing. I mean, this is why Stefan Molyneux, an ardent atheist and someone who even wrote a book making the case for atheism, does not object to Christianity, actually, in comparison to atheism, at least from a practical standpoint, because looking at all the statistics, it shows that the more right-wing Christians are the ones who are against big government. And if you look even to the people, for example, who do not send their kids to public school, a lot of it is religiously motivated. The private school system is dominated by religious schools, and homeschooling is dominated by, generally speaking, more religious right-wingers. And traditional communities or traditional values are far more conducive to independence from the state than leftism, which seeks to, generally speaking, destroy tradition. An example of this is with regards to providing for those in need or those who do not have enough resources. Generally speaking, if there is no strong sense of community or homogeneity, which are strongest in relatively traditional, homogenous, conservative societies, the state is going to need to be involved. And it is possible that the relative homogeneity and traditional values of the right is more conducive to strong, independent communities that do not need government support to fill the void left by a lack of community or a lack of homogeneity, which is one of the problems with multiculturalism. This is documented by Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone, that showed, especially in the more leftist, multicultural areas over time, that community involvement in the United States has declined massively as these sort of leftist policies have increased and been implemented. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my take on why libertarians always seem to lose. This is Bastiat, and thank you for watching.